Hey guys, tonight we're rewinding time to look at what it really meant to be a kid back in the day. Not your day, not the day of Nintendo 64s, TikToks, and school lunch debates over who had better string cheese. No, I mean way back. Back when childhood was less about playdates and more about plagues, farm animals, and surviving long enough to grow a beard. So, before you get too cozy under your weighted blanket, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy truth bombs wrapped in sarcasm. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you were when you first realized children used to be free labor. Now, dim the lights, maybe clutch your favorite stuffed animal, and let's journey into a past where toys were sharp, diseases were everywhere, and the concept of childhood was mostly theoretical. Chapter 1. Congratulations, it's a baby. Now put it to work. Welcome to the world, tiny human. You've just been born into medieval Europe, ancient Egypt, Victorian London, revolutionary China, feudal Japan, or a Maya village tucked in the rainforest. Doesn't matter. The air is filthy, the midwife has seen some things, and no one's handing out cigars. Just linen scraps, smoldering herbs, and vague hope. You're not swaddled in anything plush. You're wrapped in whatever cloth wasn't used to wipe a donkey that morning. Or, in Mesoamerica, maybe some leftover bark fiber softened by boiling and pounded flat by a tired ant. Your first lullaby is the sound of your mother sighing into a pot of boiling maize or gruel. The priest, shaman, ancestor mask is already looming in the corner, offering blessings, threats, or both. Your odds. Not great. In many eras, child mortality rates made your first 5 years basically a suspense thriller. Half of your cohort won't make it past teething. Germs are winning. Diarrhea is undefeated. You sneeze once and someone's already digging a tiny grave. Let's get global. In ancient Sparta, if you were born weak or deformed, they might just throw you off a cliff. Efficiency, baby. In Renaissance Italy, you were swaddled into a burrito so tight that your bones could realign, but not in a good way. In Qing Dynasty China, you might have been wrapped in silk if you were lucky, or just left near the rice paddies while everyone else worked. Want some numbers? Sure. In 17th century London, almost 3 out of every 4 children died before age 5. In ancient Egypt, your name didn't get painted on the tomb wall unless you made it past toddlerhood. No one wants to waste good limestone. In rural Europe, you had a better chance of meeting a plague rat than living sibling number 5. Still, let's say you're lucky. You beat the odds. Congrats. Everyone cheers. Your father names you after his great-uncle who died in a cider barrel. Your mother hands you a wooden rattle with 3 splinters and a nail poking out. And now that you've drawn breath, you're officially part of the workforce. Your first job? Stay alive. Your next job? Stay out of the fire, because most homes had an open hearth in the middle of a one-room house. You know what doesn't mix well with a waddling baby, an unguarded pit of flames and boiling stew. In summer, you roast. In winter, you freeze and get shoved next to a goat for body heat. You don't have a crib, you get a drawer, or a basket, or the softest part of the dirt floor. In nomadic Mongol yurts, you might get a sling near the ceiling beams, prime draft real estate. In Incan stone huts, you might be swaddled and wedged between the wall and a pile of potatoes. No diapers, by the way, cloth at best. A handful of moss if you're outdoors, that bucket in the corner. Your personal medieval toilet, sanitation is theoretical. That rash on your belly, probably fine. Probably. Siblings, oh yes. The population pyramid is very much a triangle. Someone is always being born, always being buried, always biting you, or possibly breastfeeding next to you. In some cultures, siblings were so plentiful, you were known as third son who survived, not even given a name until you proved you could dodge the seasonal flu. By age 1, you're crawling around barefoot on a floor layered in straw, dirt, rat droppings, and breadcrumbs from last week's festival. In Africa's Great Zimbabwe, you might be scooting across packed clay and ash. In Inuit homes? Caribou hides. Everything ends up in your mouth anyway. Congratulations, you now have intestinal parasites. If you're in a noble family, your experience is slightly better. Your linen is whiter, your porridge is thicker, and your governess has only mildly scolded you in Latin today. In the Aztec capital, you might get your first tiny obsidian knife as a sacred gift, useful for rituals and pointing menacingly at your cousins. By age 2, you're toddling into danger, open fires, angry livestock, stairs with no railings, water wells with no lids. In some Bedouin cultures, children learned early not to trip over tent ropes, or the consequences involved both embarrassment and bruises. In ancient India, you might wander into the goat pen and emerge with a new scar and valuable lesson about personal space. At 3, you're told to hush. Children are seen and not heard. Unless you're royalty, then you're seen, heard, weighed, judged, painted, betrothed, and paraded like a tiny decorative lamp made of politics. By 4, you're already being sized up for small jobs, carrying messages, fetching eggs, shouting warnings like Fox in the Henhouse, or Jeffrey's fallen in the well again. In Viking settlements, you might be guarding sheep. In Edo period Japan, you're running errands for your father's rice shop while praying you don't trip and spill someone's fortune. Your toys are either lethal, edible, or imaginary. A stick is a horse. A rag doll is your best friend. A frog is entertainment, nutrition, and sometimes a projectile. In ancient Mesopotamia, children played with clay figurines, which doubled as tools once dried. In the Andes, spinning tops were made from llama bones. Childhood was always multitasking. When sickness hits, and it will, your options are limited. The town healer arrives with herbs, charms, and a terrifying grin. You're wrapped in mustard-soaked bandages, or rubbed with warm goat butter, or asked to sleep under a cabbage leaf while someone chants about Saint Apollonia. In other places, you drink powdered turtle shell, stare into the smoke of burning cow dung, or wear an amulet made from a bird's foot and someone's leftover prayer. You are not babied. You are aged like cheese, fast, hard, and full of mysterious spots. No one is reading you bedtime stories. They're too busy trying not to freeze to death. Nobody's tracking milestones unless it's learned to walk before walking into a fire pit. Every day is a gauntlet. Avoid burns. Don't eat the wrong berries. Try not to be underfoot when the ox cart rolls through the yard. Your developmental toys include kitchen knives, boiling kettles, and livestock with no sense of personal space. By 5, you've seen birth, death, and everything in between. Maybe even helped dig a grave or chase a runaway pig through the neighbor's outhouse. You're not innocent. You're initiated. You've already got opinions on weather patterns, which midwife is drunk most often, and how best to catch rats. Food? It's what's available. Gruel, pottage, salted fish, stale bread. In the Arctic, you're gnawing frozen seal fat. In the Caribbean, you're eating cassava and learning which roots are delicious versus fatal. If you're teething, here's a crust of bread hard enough to file your milk teeth down to dust. No one is checking for allergies. Got a nut allergy? Too bad. Today's meal is mystery stew with bonus crunch. Sleep is optional. You're woken by crowing roosters, snoring adults, screaming siblings, or just the sound of the neighbor's cow trying to break into your yard. Pillows are rare, beds are communal. In ancient Korea, you might sleep on a heated stone floor. In a Mongolian yurt, you sleep curled between siblings and saddles. Nighttime is when the cold really sets in and the wolves come out to scream at the moon and existential dread. By the age of 5, if you're still breathing and walking upright, you're promoted. Now you carry water, feed animals, and keep watch over your younger siblings while your mother tries to coax a fire into life with damp straw and frustration. No birthday parties, no cake, no candles. If you're lucky, you get a nod and a piece of slightly less stale bread. The real gift is you're still alive and no one's actively bleeding. So yes, welcome to the world, child of history. The good news, you exist. The bad news, you now have responsibilities. Forever. Chapter 2. Toys? You mean sharp? Farming tools? Childhood in the past had about the same amount of fun as a root canal conducted in a coal mine. Modern kids have toys that talk, blink, and order replacement batteries on Amazon. But in the year 1320, your playset is a rock, a stick, and whatever wasn't nailed down. If you were lucky enough to be born to a noble family, you might have a carved wooden horse or a leather ball stuffed with straw. And if you're Egyptian royalty, a wax crocodile, perhaps. Fun and cursed. But for the average child, your options ranged from whatever your sibling didn't swallow to sharpened stick you found behind the outhouse. Your favorite game? Don't get tetanus. In feudal Japan, kids spun tops made from leftover rice bowl lids or folded paper into tiny shuriken and then promptly lost an eye. In Viking settlements, kids played a game called Nataliker, which was basically field hockey if you replaced the field with rocks and the ball with violence. In ancient Rome, you might have had dice carved from bones or knuckle bones, yes, literal animal bones, and dolls with movable limbs. Not bad until you realize most came with detachable heads and a side of plague. In Aztec cities, boys practiced throwing miniature spears at clay targets, while girls played house, with clay cookware and real fire. Mayan kids played with rubber balls that doubled as training for the real thing, where losing wasn't just disappointing, it was deadly. Games of make-believe were common across cultures, but not the tea party with stuffed animals kind. More like, pretend you're a soldier and reenact the war you watched from behind the goat shed. And many games weren't games at all. They were just chores you hadn't figured out how to complain about yet. Herding sheep? Game? Gathering firewood? Game? Not drowning while carrying a jug of water half your size? Olympic-level game? In West African villages, children played drumming games and danced, while also practicing how to dodge stampeding cattle and sibling projectiles. In indigenous Australian communities, boomerangs were both tools and toys, which is adorable right up until you forget to duck. In rural Russia, children skated on frozen rivers using carved animal bones tied to their feet with twine. In the Andes, they flew kites made from cloth scraps and dried reeds, when they weren't being recruited to chase llamas or fend off foxes. In Native American tribes, hoop and pole was a popular test of dexterity. In medieval Islamic culture, kids played chess, yes, actual chess, because strategy was considered a worthy pastime even before you lost your baby teeth. If you had siblings, and you did, they were your toy shelf, sparring partner, and emotional support animal. You wrestled in the mud, you bit, you ran until someone broke something or screamed loud enough to summon a parent. If you were the oldest, you were in charge. If you were the youngest, you were bait. Some toys were creative masterpieces. Dolls made from rags, corn husks, or twigs. miniature carts built from bark and rope, wooden animals carved with the same care given to dinner utensils. In Korea, children made spinning tops from seashells. In India, clay animals were baked in sun-heated kilns until they shattered or someone stepped on them barefoot. But others? Not so wholesome. In medieval Europe, kids made mock gallows to hang toy criminals. In ancient China, you might have launched insects into the air using a leaf and a dare. Some Roman children reportedly reenacted gladiator fights, yes, with blood. Childhood was not exempt from Rome's flair for the dramatic. In Slavic regions, kids played a game called gorodki, where you used a bat to knock down geometric arrangements of wooden pins, like bowling but angrier. In Ethiopia, Gebeta was a Mancala-style board game carved into rock that doubled as a counting tool. Mischief wasn't just tolerated, it was the primary fuel source of under 12-year-olds. Windows were broken. Chickens were framed. Mud was weaponized. If something exploded, someone under 4 feet tall was responsible. Children in rural communities often ran in gangs, miniature war bands armed with sticks, slings, and loud opinions. In port towns, kids snuck onto ships and got caught trying to sell a stolen rope. In towns with markets, they stole apples. In forests, they made traps for squirrels, though usually caught their own foot. Any unattended cart was a race car. Any pond was an opportunity to find leeches and throw them at someone. The line between toy and tool was razor thin, literally. That wooden scythe, play version of the real scythe, that tiny loom. Your starter pack for a life of weaving until your fingers fall off. That child-sized broom? Congratulations, you're an unpaid janitor with no rights. Even in fun, there was danger. Your top could splinter. Your sling could miss. Your little sibling could swallow your dice. And you were one bad hopscotch away from a bone infection. There was no adult supervision, just older kids who barely survived their own trial runs and yelled, "You're fine," through missing teeth. Play wasn't a break from work, it was work training. A short-lived phase between swaddling and servitude. You weren't developing motor skills. You were learning how not to die. And what about group games? Sure, but only if you count throw rocks at that thing as a bonding experience. Some kids played tag, except the "it" was often livestock, or a chicken that nobody caught until dinner. Others built forts out of whatever was available. Firewood, crates, broken shields, dreams. In towns where snow fell, snowball fights were the ancient equivalent of military drills. Some included slings. In warmer climates, you might organize a game of try not to cry when the neighborhood goat eats your doll. So, next time someone says kids used to play outside more, remind them they also used to play with fire, literally. Because fire was warm, fun, and, like all good toys, just dangerous enough to make it interesting. Games you didn't survive. Childhood accidents through history. Childhood games were not designed with safety in mind. They were designed with sharp edges, poor supervision, and the unspoken goal of natural selection. A Roman child was once impaled by a toy spear, because javelin practice and toddlers apparently mixed. In medieval towns, boys reenacted battles using actual sticks and sometimes actual injuries. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay figurines were fun until someone swallowed one. In 18th century Russia, kids ice skated on frozen rivers with animal bones strapped to their feet. Great until the ice cracked. In Japan, kids made tiny fireworks by accident. In Aztec culture, miniature weapon training was encouraged, sometimes leading to actual injuries. No warning labels, no helmets, just you, a splintered toy, and the possibility of becoming a footnote in your village priest's journal. And, if you learned enough, you might grow up to be a clerk, a monk, or an exhausted parent wielding the same stick and handing out the same miserable verses. At least, that's how the stories go. Chapter 3. Chores, the Childhood Curriculum. Let's say you've survived infancy, and playtime hasn't removed any critical limbs. Congratulations, you've unlocked the next level. Work. Actual, back-breaking, soul-condensing work. Not the make your bed and pick up your Legos kind. No, we're talking about hauling, fetching, scrubbing, lifting, grinding, and shoveling things older than your family tree. At age 5, you're not just playing with miniature brooms. You are the broom. If something's dirty, you clean it. If something's broken, you hold it in place while an adult yells at it. If you're lucky, you get a break to carry something twice your weight down a rocky hill. In medieval Europe, you might rise before dawn to help your mother bake bread in a smoky one-room cottage that doubles as a kitchen, stable, and mushroom farm, accidentally. In ancient China, your tiny hands are perfect for weeding rice paddies. In Egypt, you're helping mix mud bricks, with bonus points for not sinking into the Nile. If you're a girl, your chores come with thread and needles. You're spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and being judged on the evenness of your stitching like your social worth depends on it, because it does. If you're a boy, you get handed a dull blade and told to shave the pig. You ask no questions. You simply comply. Children in Mayan villages ground maize on stone slabs for hours. Viking kids cleaned fish, and not just the cute kind. Some of those things had more teeth than relatives. Roman children ran errands for the household or stood in line for water with clay pots nearly their height, navigating urban chaos like tiny unpaid couriers. In colder regions, kids shoveled snow off roofs so they didn't collapse in the night. In hotter ones, they carried water in blistering heat, because death by dehydration was considered an inefficient way to learn responsibility. In Ethiopia, kids herded livestock for hours on end, using rocks and loud voices as GPS. In feudal Japan, young boys assisted samurai with armor maintenance, because nothing says childhood like sharpening a sword taller than you. In the Amazon, you'd learn to carry firewood on your back and keep an eye out for jaguars. No pressure. In Polynesian island cultures, children climbed trees to collect coconuts. In some cases, they were better at it than the adults. Falling meant injury. Not falling meant you brought back snacks. Welcome to the reward system. And don't think Sundays were a break. You had to go to church, sit still and look humble for hours while being told how sinful you were for existing. Then it was back home to clean chamber pots or pluck feathers from a half-dead goose that's giving you side-eye. Did you enjoy your birthday? Too bad. It's time to gather firewood again. Got lice? You still have to feed the pigs. Lost a toe to frostbite? Wrap it in a leaf and keep milking that goat. Chores waited for no one. In some cases, you were the family appliance. Want butter? Churn it. Need laundry done? Here's a tub, a bar of soap made from ash and fat, and an afternoon of misery. Wish you had shoes? Sew them from the hides you scraped yourself. And if the thread breaks, cry quietly into the matted wool. There was no, "Are you feeling okay?" No, "Do you need a rest?" Only, "Why aren't you done yet?" Your only PTO was passed out temporarily. And of course, everything was a test. How fast you scrubbed, how much you carried, how quietly you suffered. Fail, and you might get scolded. Fail twice, and you might get hit with the same broom you just finished using. Or worse, given more chores to atone for your poor chore performance. In big households, kids rank themselves by task prestige. Drawing water from the well, top tier, cleaning out the privy, rock bottom. Everyone avoided pig pit duty like it was cursed, which it basically was. It smelled like the devil's laundry basket and occasionally fought back. In castles, young pages polished armor until they could see their own miserable little faces in it. In monasteries, boys copied religious texts for hours before they even understood the language. In mining towns, kids were sent down tunnels because they were fun-sized enough to fit where adults couldn't. If a neighbor needed help, you were loaned out like a human rake. Need a fence post held? Send a child? Need sheep herded through a narrow gap? Child, need something blamed when your loom collapses? Child, and heaven help you if guests were coming. That meant bonus chores. Scrub the floor, sweep the hearth, beat the dust out of every object that could hold dust. Suddenly, everything became a test of your worthiness to be seen in public. If you messed up, the consequences weren't just a stern talking to. You might lose supper, be grounded, except grounded meant extra wood chopping, or be reassigned to a worse job. There was always a worse job. Children didn't have to grow up fast. They were born into a job interview and immediately hired with zero pay and endless expectations. Your shift started at dawn and ended when your eyelids betrayed you. So yes, chores were the curriculum. Obedience, endurance, and silence were the learning outcomes. You didn't get gold stars. You got calluses and the deeply embedded knowledge that if you dropped that bucket, it would be the last thing you ever dropped, and tomorrow, you'd do it all again. Because the chickens won't feed themselves, and neither, apparently, will you. Chapter 4. School, where the beatings were part of the lesson. Now, let's imagine for a moment you were too lucky. You didn't get conscripted into full-time goat duty by age 6. Maybe your parents were artisans. Maybe you lived near a temple. Maybe, fate of fates, you were born into a family that believed in literacy. Congrats. You've earned the right to be smacked with a stick indoors. In much of the past, education wasn't about nurturing minds. It was about obedience, memorization, and bracing for impact. Writing, important. Reading, sometimes. But silence, posture, and a healthy fear of your tutor's cane, non-negotiable. In medieval Europe, if you went to a monastic school, you woke up early, prayed, sat on cold stone, and copied Latin phrases until your hand. Bonus points if you weren't left-handed, those were suspected of witchcraft. If you coughed during morning psalms, the nun in charge of discipline would show you the educational properties of oak rods. In ancient China, children recited Confucian classics from dawn till dusk. You'd memorize texts you didn't understand, and if you hesitated mid-recital, your teacher might give you a helpful tap with a bamboo stick, or a shove, or a lecture about your dishonored ancestors and the moral failings of your entire bloodline. Ancient Egyptian boys training as scribes spent years learning hieroglyphs, a writing system with 700-plus characters. Make a mistake, enjoy being corrected with a reed stick dipped in ink and sarcasm. Education was literally written in pain. Greek schools offered some variety, philosophy, geometry, rhetoric, but mostly it was about who could speak the longest without stuttering and who could dodge a sandal to the back of the head during debate. Logic and public speaking were valued, so were good calves for running away from your instructor. Girls, unless you were very rich or destined for a nunnery, education meant sewing straight lines, balancing jugs, and not speaking unless prompted by marriage negotiations. Most were taught to run a household, not a syllogism. In some cases, girls were educated at home, if at all, and only if the family could afford to teach them letters between stitching linens and surviving childbirth. But it wasn't just elite kids getting schooled. In the Islamic Golden Age, cities like Baghdad and Cordoba had schools for all boys, teaching math, literature, and science far ahead of Europe. Algebra, optics, and astronomy weren't electives, they were mandatory. But again, quiet, clean, and compliant or whack. That's the system. In Mesoamerica, Aztec boys were sent to either the Telpacali or the Kamicac, depending on status. One taught practical skills for warriors, the other turned elite kids into priests, scholars, or sacrifices in waiting. Either way, you learned fast or you learned hard. In sub-Saharan Africa, education was often oral and deeply communal. Elders taught proverbs, history, survival, and how not to anger the spirits. Tests included wrestling matches, recitations, or not dropping hot coals during ritual tasks. Failures earned shame, not always beatings, but sometimes exclusion, which felt worse. In indigenous North American cultures, education came from observation, imitation, and story. Lessons weren't in books, they were in the forest, the river, the fire. Get it wrong? Nature corrected you faster than any angry monk. You didn't need detention. You just needed to misidentify a bear track. In India, the Gurukula system had you living with your teacher. You swept floors, fetched firewood, and memorized Sanskrit texts so old even the local priests forgot what half the verses meant. Question something? Receive a palm-sized answer across your backside. The tools of learning: slates, wax tablets, styluses, sometimes your own blood if the ink ran out and the tutor had opinions. Ink was expensive, mistakes were wasteful. The solution: write correctly or weep creatively. And let's talk about curriculum. There was no choose your electives. You were assigned religious texts, moral proverbs, and accounts of kings who made better decisions than you ever will. In some cases, you copied the same passage 50 times. Not for understanding, just so you'd stop asking questions. In Korea, you studied for the Gwagyo civil exam for years. Didn't pass? Welcome back next year and the year after that, until you died with flashcards sewn into your funeral robes. In Renaissance Italy, schooling often involved logic, Latin, and lots of guilt. In the Ottoman Empire, boys memorized the Quran by age 10, or risked becoming that one uncle no one invited to recitations. There was no recess, there was no nap time. Just long days of chanting, copying, blinking away tears, and praying the teacher's belt broke before your will to live did. You could not go to the nurse. There was no nurse. There was vinegar for fainting and prayer for everything else. And don't think being smart spared you. Gifted students were given more work. You read double, copied triple, and helped teach the kid who kept licking the ink. Sometimes you got to read aloud, right before being interrupted by a corrective jab for reading too smugly. Punishments? Oh, they were custom fit to the culture. In Russia, it might be birch rods. In West Africa, maybe a public scolding laced with sharp proverbs. In England, you stood in a corner wearing a dunce cap, a hat so humiliating it made children wish for a more physical beating. Graduation? What graduation? You finished school when your family needed your hands elsewhere, or when your teacher had no more scrolls, or when you finally failed one test too many and were quietly transitioned from student to farm assistant. So, yes, if you were educated in the past, you were lucky, just not in the way modern kids would recognize. Because learning wasn't about self-discovery, It was about surviving the schoolmaster and escaping with some verbs and your dignity still intact. Of course, not every schoolhouse came with a cane and a threat. Some teachers taught with kindness, but those stories don't survive nearly as well as the ones with bruises and ink-stained fingers. And if you learned enough, you might grow up to be a clerk, a monk, or an exhausted parent forcing your own child to recite those same miserable verses while wielding the exact same stick. Chapter 5. Illness, the final exam. You didn't study for. Let's say you made it through chores, school, and toy-induced tetanus. Don't celebrate yet. Because in the historical childhood gauntlet, nothing came for you faster or itchier than disease. Modern kids worry about the sniffles. Historical kids worried about whether today's sniffle was actually the opening act of the Black Death. Most childhood illnesses were a game of roulette. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, the plague, or something with no name but lots of pus. You might catch something from your cousin, your goat, or the wind. The cure? Cross your fingers. And if that doesn't work, drink onion water and bleed from the elbow. Doctors were few and far between. In most places, your doctor was an herbalist, midwife, priest, or that one aunt who boiled everything in vinegar and yelled at the infection. Treatments were as likely to kill you as cure you. Got a fever? Let's remove some blood. Got chills? Time for hot stones and a prayer to St. Hubert. In many cultures, illness wasn't just a biological issue. It was a spiritual one. In ancient Greece, bad health might mean you offended Apollo. In ancient India, it might be karma. In sub-Saharan Africa, it might mean spirits were displeased. The treatment? Herbs, chants, isolation, and a ritual that involved loud drumming and someone waving burning leaves over your bed. Children were especially vulnerable. Their immune systems were softer than a boiled potato, but they were still expected to show up, work, and not die in the process. No sick days, no chicken soup. You worked until your cough became a rattle, and then they wrapped you in linen and cried quietly. In colder climates, pneumonia and bronchitis were constant companions. Wet clothes? Too bad. You still had to haul wood. In hotter ones, malaria and parasites turned your insides into a biological scream. Clean water? Rare? Soap? Pricier than most children's lives. In Southeast Asia, children fought dengue and intestinal worms. In the Arctic, the cold didn't just kill, it infiltrated lungs and settled in bones. In desert climates, dehydration danced hand in hand with dysentery, and in just about every culture, food poisoning was its own rite of passage. And don't forget tetanus. One rusty nail and your limbs locked up like medieval drawbridges. Or rickets from a diet of mostly bread, more bread, and possibly a turnip. Or scurvy if you lived somewhere fruit had never been invented. Ringworm, impetigo, lice infestations so severe your hair moved independently, these weren't rare. They were your Tuesday. Children in Rome were dosed with wine for teething. Children in medieval England had charms tied around their necks for whooping cough. Children in the Andes were rubbed with llama fat and told not to make eye contact with the wind. In Japan, you might be given ground-up seashells or bitter root tea. In Nigeria, you'd wear beads for protection and be washed in river water blessed by elders. The hospital? Hilarious. Hospitals were where you went to die near other dying people. They were poorly lit, constantly damp, and usually run by monks who believed in prayer, bleeding, and occasionally holding your hand while you expired. In the best-case scenario, you'd leave with fewer body parts but more wisdom. In the worst case, they forgot you were there. And the smells. Oh, the smells. Children's bedrooms reeked of poultices, urine-soaked straw, spoiled broth, and regret. Everyone had lice, everyone had fleas, bedbugs, a given. You didn't sleep through illness. You slept with illness. It shared your blanket, borrowed your breath, and coughed in your mouth. Disease made you philosophical. You learned to rank fevers. You could tell what kind of illness someone had by the way they sighed. You knew the death rattle before your teeth came in. You could judge the potency of a poultice by its scent alone, and had strong opinions on which animal fat made the best compress. Some illnesses came with perks. Get smallpox and survive? Congrats, you're now slightly immune and covered in pitted scars that serve as a conversation starter. Measles survivors often had lifelong immunity and partial hearing loss. But most diseases didn't come with a silver lining, just a shallow grave and a vague footnote in someone's family tree. Surviving childhood wasn't about vitamins and good hygiene, it was luck. Cosmic luck. The kind of luck that made your parents name future kids after you just in case, or bury your shoes under the floorboards to protect your younger siblings. Because in the past, there was no such thing as a mild childhood. Every cough had a backstory. Every rash had a folklore tale. Every fever had its own legend. And every sneeze came with the quiet question, "Is this it?" And it wasn't just disease that hunted you, it was also injury. Fall off a ladder? Infection. Trip near a stove? Burns. Step on a nail? Game over. Break a bone? Better hope it doesn't break the skin or you'll be playing "Will the Swelling Kill Me?" And burns. Oh, the burns. Fire was central to survival. Cooking, heating, lighting. But for a child, it was temptation in open flame form. You played too close, reached for the kettle, knocked over a candle, and suddenly you were the cautionary tale whispered to siblings. There were splinters from carts, bruises from livestock, gashes from tools you had no business touching but were handed anyway. "He needs to learn," they said. You learned all right. You learned how to cry quietly and keep working. Even the air was dangerous. Smoke from indoor fires coated your lungs in soot. In some regions, ventilation was a hole in the ceiling. That hole also let in rain, birds, and occasionally God's judgment. If disease didn't catch you directly, it came secondhand. An older sibling brought it home. A goat sneezed on you. You drank from a stream you were told was probably fine. You kissed your granny goodnight, and 2 days later she was a ghost and you had a cough. Vaccination? Not for centuries. The closest thing was variolation, which involved scraping the pus from an infected person's sore and gently rubbing it into your skin. Gentle, meaning agonizing. Safe, meaning statistically debatable. Did people care? Deeply. Did they have the tools to help? Rarely. Most responses to disease were combinations of herbal hope and divine bargaining. You'd find entire villages praying under eclipses or leaving bread at crossroads to appease spirits. Superstition filled the gaps in science. Kids were tied with red strings to ward off evil. Cold water was both cure and cause. A green tinge in your skin meant death or spinach. Hard to say. You didn't recover. You either lived or you didn't. If you lived, you gained status. You were tougher, marked, scarred. Your friends whispered about you like a legend. That's Thomas. He survived the cough that took out half the barn. So, next time someone complains about flu shots or staying home with a sore throat, kindly remind them. In the old days, a sore throat was Chapter 1 of This Kid's Not Gonna Make It. And if you made it to 10, congratulations. You were either a miracle or already coughing into your apprenticeship contract. Chapter 6. Apprenticeship, Childhood's Retirement Plan. Spoiler, it's not retirement. If you somehow made it to the ripe old age of 10 without being claimed by dysentery, dropped into a well, or cursed by an angry neighbor, congratulations. You're ready for the next big step. Work that lasts until your spine folds into a question mark. Apprenticeship was childhood's official exit ramp. You didn't drift into adulthood with therapy and journaling. You were handed to a stranger with a trade and a temper. Congratulations. You now belong to the town's shoemaker, blacksmith, baker, cooper, weaver, or anyone who needed small hands and free labor. The system worked like this. Your family, in a dazzling act of optimism, signed a contract pledging your physical presence and unquestioning obedience for the next 5 to 12 years, in exchange for room, board, training, and the vague promise that someday, maybe, you'd become a master yourself. Spoiler, you wouldn't. You'd move into your master's house, which was always just slightly colder, damper, and emotionally more repressed than your own. You slept in the workshop or under the stairs, often next to a barrel of brine, or under a rack of tools that definitely weren't OSHA approved. Your day started before the sun and ended whenever your master got tired of shouting. And the tasks, they weren't glamorous. You fetched things, you stirred vats, you cleaned so many floors your knees developed opinions. You weren't the student. You were the janitor, delivery boy, emotional punching bag, and all-around understudy to disappointment. Apprenticeship didn't come with weekends. It came with exhaustion. You got one holy day off, unless someone needed you to carry something heavy, clean something foul, or explain to a merchant why the cart now has 3 wheels. In Europe, you apprenticed to a guild. Guilds were like secret societies with less mystery and more wood shavings. Becoming a journeyman meant years of loyal service, a surviving liver, and sometimes crafting a masterpiece to prove your worth. If you botched it, enjoy permanent mediocrity. And don't even think about starting your own shop without the guild's blessing. That was heresy with hammers. Guild slang for start your own shop and see what happens. In Japan, you trained in the family's craft. If your father made swords, you made swords. If he made sandals, you made sandals. If he made neither, you were farmed out to a relative who did. Respect for elders meant you bowed, nodded, and never questioned the fact that your lunch was the same every day for 6 years. In West Africa, you might learn to be a griot, a keeper of oral history. That meant memorizing generations of tribal lore, epic poems, and which aunt was still mad about the yam incident of 1763. Make a mistake during recitation, you got laughed at by every elder in the village, and worse, asked to start over. In India, apprentice weavers and potters began as toddlers, learning hand positions and rhythms before they could pronounce half the tools. In the Americas, apprentices learned fishing, leatherwork, and survival from tribal elders. By 12, you knew how to clean an animal, skin it, tan it, and sew it into a shoe. Bonus points if it was the same animal that tried to trample you last week. Apprenticeship was often more than a trade. It was a relocation. Some kids were sent to towns they couldn't pronounce, to live with people they'd never met. You didn't get a care package. You got instructions to make yourself useful and not die. And apprentices weren't just boys. Girls became apprentices too, though the trade was usually cooking, mending, brewing, or midwifery. And instead of a guild, you got a reputation. If your stitches were crooked or your bread fell flat, word got around. You weren't just bad at sewing, you were a scandal. Discipline? Unregulated. One mistake and you might get whipped, slapped, or forced to redo your work until your soul left your body and floated toward a better trade, like ghosting. Some masters were kind. Others were walking lawsuits if lawsuits had been invented yet. You could be punished for being too slow, too messy, too loud, or simply for existing during a bad mood. And the worst part? You didn't get paid, nothing, not a copper. You worked for experience and character, which is ancient for, your suffering builds my legacy. And if you were very lucky, you might be fed second helpings, assuming you didn't spill anything on your apron that day. Meals were quick, quiet, and vaguely nutritious. A hunk of bread, some soup, the occasional rat-adjacent stew, and you had to earn it with at least 10 hours of flawless servitude. Break something? You paid it off with extra years. Complain? You were sent home in shame, if your parents would even take you back. Some didn't. A returned apprentice was a walking failure, a cautionary tale, a punchline in the tavern. But if you survived, and that's a big if, you'd someday become a journeyman. You'd travel, carry a letter of recommendation, written by a man who never learned to spell, and look for work elsewhere. Or, more likely, inherit a corner of the workshop after your master died or was eaten by a suspiciously vengeful goat. Even then, adulthood wasn't freedom. It was responsibility without complaint. You'd take on your own apprentice one day and you'd try to be better, or not. Some turned kind, some turned cruel. Most turned into versions of their master with less hair and more regret. And there were always the nightmare trades. Tanners who soaked hides in urine and scraped them clean until the smell became part of their soul. Fullers who stomped wool in vats of stale urine to soften it, an act so vile even the rats stayed clear. Or coopers who made barrels by banging metal hoops into place until their knuckles looked like fossilized walnuts. Mining apprentices? Let's not. You were sent into shafts too small for adults, hauling sacks of ore on your back while praying the ceiling didn't collapse. And if it did, you were simply marked absent. In shipyards, apprentice shipwrights carried planks larger than themselves, learned knots from angry men with voices like gravel, and spent hours painting pitch in the hull's underbelly until their lungs became tar-flavored. In bakeries, apprentices woke up when most people were dreaming and went to bed after the bread did. You kneaded until your arms gave out, carried sacks of flour heavier than your own future, and learned the ancient ritual of blaming the yeast. In print shops, the lucky few who learned to read set type backward, and in mirror image under candlelight, while being screamed at by someone named Otto who chain-smoked pessimism. One wrong letter, and the whole page was ruined. Guess who fixed it? You. Even the so-called noble apprenticeships had dark sides. If you were a clerk, you copied endless contracts until Latin phrases haunted your dreams. If you worked in a pharmacy, you handled leeches, crushed dried beetles, and accidentally invented 3 different types of poison before lunch. And if your master died mid-training, good luck. Maybe someone took you in, maybe you inherited the business. Maybe you wandered into the woods and became a cautionary tale. There was no guidance counselor. There was only chance. Holidays? Technically, yes. Realistically, no. Feast days meant more work, not less. The shop had to be cleaned. Orders rushed, bells rung. Meals cooked for double the people. And you were on dish duty. Friendships? Rare. Your fellow apprentices were competition, confidants, and occasionally conspirators. You shared stolen snacks and whispered about escape, knowing full well you'd never actually go. It wasn't loyalty, it was exhaustion. And if you were injured, burned, broken, maimed, you wrapped it, hid it, and kept going. Apprentices didn't rest, they limped with purpose. There was always someone younger waiting to take your spot, and your master knew it. Worst of all, when the work became your identity. One day, you stopped dreaming about a life beyond the forge, the oven, the loom. You started taking pride in surviving another day. And that was it. You'd become what they wanted. Not skilled, not brilliant, just durable. So when people romanticize the old days, back when kids learned trades, just remember, those trades came with burn scars, ruptured eardrums, crooked backs, and lifelong trauma camouflaged as tradition. Apprenticeship wasn't an opportunity. It was an endurance test. A slow, grinding transformation from child to tool to, eventually, tired adult who still woke up at dawn, even when no one told you to. Because once you learned to suffer in service of someone else's dream, it became incredibly easy to forget what yours ever were. Chapter 7. No Such Thing as a Teenager. Welcome to your teenage years, except, surprise, that word doesn't exist yet. The modern idea of teenagers as hormone-powered creatures of angst and identity crises? Historical kids never got the memo. There was no moody transitional period between childhood and adulthood. There was only, you're tall enough to hold a sword. Congratulations, you're an adult. Turning 13 didn't mean you got a learner's permit. It meant you got married, went to war, took over the farm, inherited your father's debt, or gave birth in a hut built with the tears of previous generations. You were expected to contribute, obey, and not embarrass the family, preferably all at once. In medieval Europe, boys might be knighted by age 14, assuming they survived as a page and a squire long enough to prove they could sit on a horse without dying. Girls were married off, sometimes younger. If you had a uterus, your puberty was less personal milestone and more, congratulations, you're livestock now. In ancient Sparta, boys began military training at 7 and were full soldiers by 12 or 13. They lived in barracks, fought wolves for practice, and were encouraged to steal, just not get caught. In other words, they were basically boot-camped into oblivion before their voices dropped. In China, Confucian ideals meant filial piety over fun. By your teens, you were reciting virtue texts, helping run the household, or preparing for exams that could determine your social standing for life. Acne was the least of your worries. In some dynasties, boys were tested on calligraphy, poetry, and Confucian ethics. Girls were praised for their silence, embroidery, and ability to not faint during 4-hour ceremonies. In indigenous cultures, rites of passage marked this phase: vision quests, isolation, tattooing, ceremonial hunts or sacred dances, all designed to teach that becoming an adult wasn't a party. It was a ritual in survival, meaning, and pain. In some Arctic communities, boys were sent out with nothing but a spear and told to return with dinner or not at all. Adolescence wasn't an experiment, it was a contract. In ancient Rome, boys put on the toga virilis, the toga of manhood, somewhere around 14. It was less of a fashion statement and more of a giant fabric scream: I now owe taxes. Girls, meanwhile, often donned a wedding dress and were expected to produce heirs by 15. Kids today get a phone. They got a husband. There were no school dances, no driver's tests, no dramatic eye rolls while slamming your bedroom door, mostly because your bedroom was a straw mat next to 3 siblings and a bucket. Privacy, a fantasy, moodiness, a luxury, emotional growth, something that happened between milking and mending. Any personal rebellion had consequences. Talk back to your elders, get smacked. Disagree with tradition, get ignored, married off, or both. Want to explore your passions? Great. Start by learning how to mend a fence without bleeding. Poetry was nice, but could it herd goats? Your hobbies were things that helped the family not starve. Your mood swings were proof you need more chores. Your dreams, cute but impractical. Adults didn't ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because you already were. And you were either good at it or an embarrassment. And yet somehow, amidst all this, teenagers still found a way. Some snuck away to dance. Others carved their initials into trees. Some ran away to become pirates, monks, or wandering minstrels. Because even in a world of mandatory adulthood, the need to rebel never fully died. There are accounts of teens eloping, sabotaging farming equipment, or faking demonic possession just to get out of chores. And honestly, who could blame them? In the Ottoman Empire, teenage boys studied religious texts all day, but still managed to sneak out to the markets to gossip and flirt. In Victorian England, some teens ran off to join the circus, while others simply changed their names and became chimney sweeps in the next town over. Reinvention wasn't a spiritual journey, it was survival. Some teens did try to push back. Quietly, they wrote journals, they told stories, they hid keepsakes, they sang songs slightly louder than they were allowed. Micro-rebellions that whispered, "I exist." In France, during the 17th century, teens became apprentices, soldiers, or servants, but a few ran off to become highwaymen, armed robbers with flair and questionable fashion. In Scotland, some teenage boys fled their clans to avoid blood feuds. And in Russia, runaway teens sometimes ended up as Cossacks, living hard lives with a sword, a horse, and more vodka than future. In some cases, teens took to religion, not out of devotion, but for sanctuary. Monasteries were sometimes filled with kids who simply wanted out of marriage, farming, or parents who didn't believe in naps. Becoming a nun could mean escape. So could becoming a monk, though both came with a lot of chanting and very little meat. And still, pressure mounted. In Renaissance Italy, wealthy teens were expected to be charming, educated, attractive, and strategic. You had to speak Latin, dance well, manage estate finances, and recite Virgil, all before your 16th birthday. Failure wasn't an option, it was a scandal. If you were poor, your teenage years were about survival, plain and simple. Begging, borrowing, or becoming someone's assistant in a trade you didn't choose. If you were lucky, you were ignored. If you were unlucky, you were punished for trying to be anything other than exactly what was required. Even love was a logistical problem. Romance was practical, a means to merge farms, debts, or reputations. Courtship was a set of negotiations, not poetry under moonlight. And if you fell in love with the wrong person, that was a tragedy, not a phase. And in places like the Mongol Empire, if you were a teen and male, you were on a horse. If you were a teen and female, you were working, married, or preparing to be both. Your emotions were irrelevant. Your output was everything. Despite all of this, teenage resilience was real. Some kids plotted slow escapes, others dreamed louder in secret. They drew forbidden images, smuggled banned books, learned foreign languages from traveling merchants. They didn't have a youth movement, but they had youth momentum. So next time someone says, "Teens these days have it easy," remind them. In the past, being 15 meant you could be running a household, commanding a battlefield, or getting your third child baptized by candlelight. There was no in-between, there was only already. And the only rite of passage? Surviving it. Final chapter. Congratulations, you're alive, now get back to work. If you've made it this far, through disease, chores, non-existent toys, compulsory apprenticeships, medieval schoolrooms, and the crushing weight of teenage expectations, then congratulations. You're not a child anymore. You're a full-fledged historical adult. And by adult, we mean exhausted, indebted, and expected to start producing new humans as soon as possible. There was no ceremony for the end of childhood, no graduation cap, no gold watch, no Instagram post. You just worked one day, and the next day you worked harder. At some point, people stopped patting your head and started handing you bills, cows, or crying infants. That was your welcome to adulthood. Maybe you survived to your 20s, maybe you didn't. But if you did, you became part of the next generation that would tell stories about how easy kids have it these days, while conveniently forgetting you once had to sweep a courtyard with your bare hands and fight off a goose twice your size. You likely stayed in your village for life. You inherited your father's trade or your mother's obligations. If you were lucky, you made it to old age, defined as anything past 40. If you were very lucky, your children lived long enough to start hauling buckets of their own. There were moments of joy, of course, a festival day, a warm meal, a successful harvest, laughter around a fire. Even within the constraints of hardship, people danced, sang, loved, dreamed, and found meaning in the smallest victories, like not being bitten by the neighbor's donkey. But the idea of childhood as a protected golden age, that's modern, that's new. For most of history, childhood was a countdown, an accelerating blur of responsibility, expectation, risk, and labor. It wasn't a phase, it was a deadline. Final thoughts: how to be a child in the past and not make it to 10. So what have we learned? Children weren't fragile. They were feral, resilient, sturdy, tough as boiled boots and twice as loud. They were workers, soldiers, mothers, messengers, babysitters, apprentices, sacrifices, and survivors, sometimes all in the same week. They grew up fast, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And while we laugh at their hardships from the comfort of climate control and antibacterial soap, there's something humbling about knowing they once made it through storms with no coats, through fevers with no medicine, and through life with no pause button. So, next time you see a child playing in a sandbox or refusing to eat broccoli, maybe raise a mental toast to those who came before. The ones who built carts, caught rats, scrubbed latrines, stitched clothes, herded pigs, and somehow, found the time to be children too. Now, blow out the candle. Pull up the itchy wool blanket and go to sleep, little one. Tomorrow, you carry water.